Okay, well, welcome everyone. And I'm sure that Charleston is very much like Valdosta in the fact that we are at the peak of camellia season right now for the next week or so. So the timing is very good for this presentation. So this is a presentation that I have given a few times at a workshop in Fort Valley, Georgia, which is where the American Camellia Society is located. And they have a workshop, they have a hands-on workshop every year, except for this year, where you can learn a lot of the things that I'm talking about on a hands-on basis. So without further ado here, I'm going to get started. First of all, we call camellias the jewel of the winter garden. Okay, that's kind of how they're known, or the rose of the winter garden. Okay, and for some reason this won't go forward. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about how camellias are used. And first of all, they are broadleaf evergreens, and they're used as specimen plants, a focal point. You plant them in groups so that you have extended bloom season. And that's the nice thing about camellias, is that we have early bloomers, mid-season bloomers, and late bloomers. And so the early ones actually begin in October. Of course, we have the sasanquas that start the season off, but we also have a lot of japonicas now that start early, which is really nice. Sasanquas are often used as hedges and living fences, foundation and corner plantings, and of course we do show and exhibition with them. So we have the fall bloomers, which is Camellia sasanqua, Camellia oleifera, and Camellia hymalis. Those bloom typically in the fall. And then the winter bloomers are the japonicas, the reticulatas, and the hybrids. And in the japonicas, there are over 5,000 registered varieties now. So we have different kinds of bloom types. Depending on what you like, you can choose between the singles, the doubles, rose form, peonies, and anemone. And so if we look at the singles, they have just one set of petals with the stamens in the middle. The one on the right is actually a higo, and the higos are always characterized by one set of guard petals and a very large plume of stamens in the middle. And these are very popular in Japan. Okay, so then we have the semi-doubles, which have more than one set of petals, but the stamens show prominently, usually in the middle. Okay, and then we have the formal doubles, which for these, no stamens show. There are no stamens showing, and they are sterile. They do not form seed. So, and these are the ones, of course, that look, somewhat like a rose. But then we do have the rose form double, where the flower is very much like a rose, particularly as it opens, it looks just like a rose. So, and then we have the peonies, where we have the stamens and the petals all interspersed in this very, usually a large flower, and the petals stand up, and it looks like a peony that you would be familiar with up north, okay? And then we have the anemones, and the anemones, where we have a tight cluster of petals, and they're actually petaloids, because they're little tiny petals that have taken the place of most of the stamens. And you can see in the pink one in the upper right, we can see just a few stamens poking through. Those didn't get modified into what we call a petaloid. So those are the primary flower types. And this is a lot how people collect them, because people are fond of certain types. Okay. And so one of the things when we look at in camellias was, I call this the positive traits, what to look for. And that's like, we want disease-resistant own root or grafted plants. You want something to be attractive all year round. You don't want something that's kind of scraggly looking in the summertime. it's nice to have things that bloom early in the season before the cold weather comes in January that we just had, which does damage the flowers. But they come back pretty quick, particularly when the weather warms up like it just has. You want something that blooms every year, and you want things that open full and don't bullnose. And bullnosing is this case where the flower doesn't fully open. And this is actually one of the problems with some of the older varieties that came from Europe, because we don't have enough cold here, enough chill hours to make them open properly. So you'll see these older varieties and they'll like partially open and then they fall off. And that's something that we try to avoid with our more modern varieties. And then you want strong stems so the flowers don't droop. Okay. And so we're going to talk about the various things that about growing them now. And the number one thing is planting. So you acquire a new camellia, the number one thing that you have to be aware of is don't plant it too deep. Most people want to plant them level with grade, and that is too deep. You want to plant them above grade, at least 2 to 3 inches. And the reason for that is that a lot of times they sink, and they sink because the bark-based media that they're grown in the container, in the nursery, will decompose over time and shrink. And that shrinkage, along with soil settling, will cause them to sink, and then they will be too deep if you plant them level. So it's very important to plant them above grade. And a lot of times I've had people say, well, my plant hasn't grown for several years. Dig it up and raise it up, and it will probably come back and do well. So that's just something that's so important. I can't stress it enough. And in Charleston, with your sandy soil, this is a problem. And so here's just a depiction of how you want to plant it 2 to 3 inches above grade. You want to pack the base so that it won't settle too much, and then you want to mulch it. And the mulching is so that the elevated area doesn't erode when we have like a heavy rainstorm. Okay, so let's talk about some of the more modified ways of planting. So typically, camellias are planted in a woodland environment, a lot of trees, usually a lot of big trees. And when you dig a hole, you're going to be digging through a whole lot of tree roots. And then if you amend that soil, those trees like that amendment just as much as that camellia does. So one of the things that you can do to kind of help the camellia get a good start early on without competing trees is to line the holes with the spiral formation of newspaper, and that will keep the tree roots out for the first year. It only lasts about a year, but by that time, the camellia roots have been able to get out and start growing into the native soil from the container. So you've given them a little bit of a start before those tree roots start to invade that area. And so this is kind of typically how it would look. You would put it in like I just showed you, fill it with the right level of soil, and put your plant in. And then backfill it. And so you fluff up the roots and all that, backfill, and then you never know the newspaper is there. So it's raised up that couple 2 to 3 inches, and that plant's off to a good start then. This works really well, folks, I'm telling you. You're going to plant them around trees. The worst trees, by the way, are magnolias. They're devils. You almost can't win with a magnolia tree. Okay. Another issue with planting is, and this is something that nurseries do that I do not do, is this multiple sticking of cuttings or plants in pots. And this is not a good idea, folks, okay? Because it makes the plant look really pretty in the pot, and you got this nice bushy, full looking plant. But I will tell you that over time, one of those is gonna die, 2 of them might die, and I've actually had all 3 of them die because they start competing with each other. And so it is best to have single stem camellias. Now, sasanquas, you can get away with a double stem. They aren't quite so prone to the competition effect of being close to each other, okay? Because a lot of times they are double stuck, okay? And so another problem you might encounter with planting is plants that have been left in containers for too long, and they get really root bound. There's very little soil remaining around the roots. And when you plant these, and if you don't go to some extra trouble, that root ball will dry out differentially than the surrounding soil. And oftentimes that will lead to the plant not surviving because that root ball has dried out. Because it's really hard to keep it wet because of the way the roots are all bound up. So the best thing to do is to take that plant and wash all of that old bark and stuff out of the root system, put it in your hole, put some soil in the hole, and then flood it, and that makes the soil flow into the roots so that you don't have any air pockets when you plant that. And then you have that, and then you just plant it and it's fine. So that's just another thing if you got something that's really root bound. And you generally know when it's been in the pot too long. Okay? So the next thing we're going to talk about is pruning. Pruning is always a big question for me. Particularly, I'm a big proponent of pruning. And the pruning season is coming up in February and March when the plants are finished blooming. So this is something you might want to really pay attention to. So when you have small plants, virtually no pruning is required. You might, have a limb that's out of whack and you just want to take it off. But large plants can be reduced, can be cut severely, and we call this regeneration pruning. And also pruning the plants up off the ground, leaving a space between the first limbs and the ground helps reduce scale insects. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm sure some of you, being in Charleston, have purchased homes with huge camellias in the yard and maybe up against the house that are up to the eaves and so forth. You can cut those back and they will come back and they will be beautiful. And I'll show you how to do that. So this is what I kind of depict as the ideal camellia. It's about 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide. It's just like the perfect plant. They don't stay like this forever, believe me. But so then they get like this. And this is a really big plant looking up. This is the top of the plant. You can't reach the flowers if you want to cut them. They get awful pine straw over the years, and they just look bad, and they need to be regenerated. Plus, you get a lot of small flowers instead of some of the more larger size flowers that you might like to have for cutting. So what you can do, here's a really big plant that I had in my collection. It was a monster. It was outside of its allotted space, so I cut it back, and this is what I did. And I know I hear you all gasping, because everybody does. I wish I could hear you, because everybody does when I show them this. So, and this actually turned out to be not pruned enough, believe it or not, because I didn't remove the cross limbs that cross one another. So this is actually the ideal way to do regeneration pruning, is just leave a skeleton, okay? And the other thing is that you want to cut them back at an angle. All these larger limbs at an angle, and I do recommend that you paint those with some pruning paint or any kind of paint that doesn't look bad in the landscape, like something dark colored, black or brown or so forth. Because if water sits on there on a flat surface, it will rot camellia, and it will rot down in, and it can compromise the whole limb eventually. So that's really important, okay? So to show you what happens, so after you do this, about a month after you cut these back, way back, this is what you'll see. You'll see lots of little sprouts coming all over those stems. And then you wait another couple of, another month, and then this is what you see. And then by late summer, this is what it'll look like. And then by fall, it'll be completely regrown. Now, the one thing you do lose when you do this is you will lose that year of flowering, because none of this wood is all juvenile and it will not have flower buds. And so when they get to this stage, you can go in there and kind of do some selective pruning and make it the kind of plant that you want it to look like. And so here's how that plant looked in 2016. Well, and so that was about 6 years later. And I should take a picture of it now. It's like twice this big now. And this is the year it's going to get cut back to the way I showed you on that first slide with the pruning. So they do grow and they do recover. And this thing is completely covered with white blooms right now. So anyway, and so this is an area of my collection that I pruned back about, these were done 2 years ago. And so you see they all look really nice. They've come back, and now they need to be kind of, you take some of the wood out of the center of the plant, so it gives it more air. Because the flowers that form in the center of the plant, you really don't have access to. They're usually small. You want everything around the outer edges. Okay, so let's go on to some other more things, and we can talk about, probably have questions about pruning. So if you grow camellias now, you've probably heard about jibbing. And jibbing is the application of gibberellic acid to individual flowers to make them bloom early, okay, and to get larger blooms. But really it's to get them to bloom early. That's the primary purpose. And so one of the things you do is you remove the bud that's adjacent to the flower bud, and you apply the jib, 1 or 2 drops, and it's at 20,000 parts per million. And you start in September, and then those flowers will open 5 to 7 weeks after the application. So this is what you can have. This is how you can have some really nice flowers for your Thanksgiving and Christmas table, if you would like. And so this does extend the bloom period from anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. And the material that you can purchase that actually is labeled for this use is called ProGib TNO. It's actually labeled. It's a legal use to do this, okay? And so here we have a flower bud with an adjacent growth bud. So you would, or you'd have 2 buds. So you don't want 2 buds. You only want 1 terminal, so they don't been bumping into each other, and then you get malformed flowers. And so you take that growth bud and you break it out, and it leaves a little cup, and that's where you put your gibberellic acid, is in that little cup. And that flower will open in 4 to 6 weeks, okay? And so one of the things that you probably encounter on your plants now is they like to form a lot of buds. A lot of buds is not good. You get a lot of very small, inferior flowers. And so anything like this, you need to remove them, remove all the buds except for 1. It just really makes a difference on the quality of flowers you will have in your garden, okay? All right, so now let's talk about some of the bad things. And the bad things are we do have some disease issues. And our #1 disease in the Southeast is dieback, caused by a fungus, Glomerella cingulata, okay? By the way, I am a plant pathologist by training, so I know a lot about these diseases. And so the infection occurs a lot, mostly through wounds, but we do have an infection period a lot of times in the spring when the leaves fall, when we have a leaf drop on our camellias. And one thing you need to remember is that usually 1/3 of the leaves fall off on camellias every year because a leaf only has a 3-year lifespan. A single leaf has a 3-year lifespan. Okay, so the spores of this fungus are water splashed, and it's spread by either by grafting or by cutting. So it's very important that you have healthy plant material. And so we have 3 phases of the disease. We get the twig phase, the canker phase, and the dieback phase. And so this is the initial infection. This is actually from a leaf that fell off and it got infected. And you see how the stem is sunken. And this is typical of the way it looks. A sunken area on the stem. The fungus has killed all of that tissue right there. Another way it infects is that you have these little limbs and they get infected and it infects right into the main stem. And that's why you want to make sure that when you prune your camellias, you don't leave little stubs. You prune them right to the leaf, to the collar, so that they heal properly. Okay, this is then the dieback phase with the huge canker, and this is actually on a Sasanqua. And eventually that whole limb will die because that canker it compromises that plant. So this is our biggest problem here in the Southeast, where where it rains a lot and it's hot and humid. It's just the fungus just loves that. So the way we can control that is we grow the more resistant varieties, and some of them are more tolerant, I would say tolerant than others. We use resistant rootstock for grafting. So if you use grafted plants, that's important. Propagate only from healthy plants, and like I said, remove infected branches and apply a wound paint to that surface. So if you get a limb that does die back, you want to prune it and paint it. Do not over-fertilize with nitrogen. Nitrogen aggravates this. A lot of nitrogen, you get this nice lush plant, and it also encourages the fungus. Avoid overcrowding and dense shade, because again, that encourages the disease. And you want to prune those plants for open growth, like I stressed earlier. Avoid overhead irrigation if possible. And then if worse comes to worse, you can use a fungicide to control your diseases. And in the nursery environment, I have to use a fungicide to control this because I use overhead irrigation, and it's just something you have to do. So that's dieback. And here's another disease. It's not quite, it doesn't really hurt the plant so much. It's more of a cosmetic issue. And this is algal leaf spot. And this is a problem where you have very dense shade, and it's also much more prevalent on the reticulatas camellias. And it just makes them look bad. But you can control this quite easily in the spring when the new growth comes out with the copper fungicide. The copper does a great job on this. So another issue that you could have, and particularly in Charleston, where you are in the low country, literally, is that we have Phytophthora, which is a root rot. And that can be a real problem if you have any kind of a high water table or standing water for any kind of extended period of time, or just somewhere that's just kind of damp all the time. That's all bad for camellias. They want well drained. So one of the things that you can do is, first of all, you'd have grafted plants on Sasanqua rootstock, because Sasanquas are somewhat resistant to the root rot. And I can tell you that if you go to Louisiana, all of the camellias are grafted on Sasanquas because of their very high water table. They have that real kind of gooey soil there. And everything is on Sasanquas because they just don't do good otherwise because of the soil stays wet. And it's just something interesting when you go to Louisiana. It's very different. And then the other thing is that you can plant them elevated from grade and like a berm where you can have it elevated. That really helps a lot, or in raised beds if you're able to do that. Okay. So then we have this other disease, which you may be seeing now, which we call petal blight. And petal blight is kind of an insidious disease, I think, because it only affects the flowers. It has no effect whatsoever to the plant. And it is now active from now through March. And what this does, this is what makes the flowers collapse literally maybe a few days after they open. And the fungus survives in the leaf litter and the soil with these fruiting bodies called sclerotia, which is like it's a resting stage of the fungus. And so that will be stimulated, and what stimulates the little sclerotia to form a little mushroom, okay, forms a teeny tiny little mushroom that you can actually find if you dig around under your plants. And this is pretty much everywhere, by the way. It produces these, that little mushroom forms after we have 2 freezes. And this has been well documented by research in New Zealand, actually. When you get 2 freezes, which we've just had, then the sclerotia are activated, they form a little mushroom, and the spores are windborne. Okay, so this is what petal blight looks like versus what something like an old flower. Petal blight on the right, you see, it emanates from the center of the flower outward, whereas other things like botrytis that might affect your flower, or even just sunburn and winter injury, you won't see that. You won't see that fungal growth coming out from the center of the flower. And this is how you tell the difference, because everybody says everything is petal blight and it isn't. Okay. And so here's the life cycle kind of depicted to give you an idea. So you have a flower that's showing signs of petal blight, and you see that on this white flower that kind of where it's got some injury there on the flower, and then the whole thing will just collapse. And again, it's emanating out from the center. That flower will fall to the ground and form those little sclerotia form in the tissue of the flower. And then the flower rots away, and then they're just left in the soil. And there are the little mushrooms that form from the sclerotia. They produce spores that then reinfect the flower. So that's a 1-year cycle. So petal blight that occurs this year won't infect flowers until next year. Okay, so everything is from last year or the year before. And so one of the problems with this disease is those little sclerotia will survive in the soil for up to 7 years. And so it's really hard to get rid of them. And so now this is an example of winter injury. So you might see this when we have a cold spell and the flowers turn brown. It's also very indicative of sun injury, particularly on light colored flowers. They will burn when we have clear sunny days like we've had in the last few days. They'll open up and they'll be really pretty, but they'll get sunburned. And that's part of the reason we grow camellias under shade, and particularly under pine trees, because that prevents that from occurring. But this is not a disease. This is strictly environmental. Okay? So petal blight can be controlled primarily through sanitation. You've got to pick up those dead flowers. You can grow really early varieties and really late varieties as a way to escape the disease cycle. This is one of the reasons we jib, is we escape the petal blight problem because we're blooming early, usually before Christmas. We don't really see this problem before Christmas. You can cover the ground with a ground cover fabric as a way, and you can replace the mulch every year. And I know people who do that. You just replace the mulch every year to get rid of anything from the previous year. And You can use a fungicide, but it's not very effective. It just doesn't really work. So I just say that because some people say yes, but it doesn't really work. Okay, so here we have a lot of dead flowers, or on the ground. Those should be picked up. And I know if you have a large collection, that's a big task. But that's one of the ways that you can prevent petal blight from infecting your area. However, I will remind you that one of the problems with this disease too is that when the spores form, they can travel up to a mile away. So if your next door neighbor doesn't pick up their flowers, it's not going to really do you much good if you pick up yours. So that's kind of the sad part of this, that it just doesn't work that well unless you're kind of in an isolated place and don't have a lot of neighbors with camellias. Then if you keep your, and I know of a collection down in Ocala, Florida, that's in the middle of like nothing but horse pastures. There's no other camellias anywhere within a couple of miles. There is no petal blight there. And it's pretty amazing to see that. Okay, so let's talk about insect pests now. And we do have a few of those. We have aphids, mealybugs, scale, and beetles. And then the primary mite problems is what I call the southern red mite. Not so much spider mites. They're not as bad a problem as some people think. So this is beetle damage. This is a little beetle that it lays its eggs in the buds in the fall, and in the buds that are going to grow the following spring. And so what happens is the larvae eat the new leaves as they're unfolding in the spring. And this is what you get, this sort of skeletonized look. And it really makes your plants look terrible. And you can get this in the midsummer too. So this is controlled with usually some type of systemic insecticide, because it's inside those little buds, and you have to have something that's going to work on the inside. And so it's a close-up of that. It really just makes the plants look awful. Okay, and so here we have southern red mites, and they start in the center of the leaf along the midrib, and they work their ways out to the edges. And they cause this bronzing effect. This is a big problem in the fall when we have warm days and cool nights and no rain. They go crazy, and they can turn your plant from a beautiful green plant to a totally bronzed plant like this in like 2 to 3 days. It's really quick. And the way you can control this is just to apply oil, just a summer oil, horticultural oil to your plants. And it does a good job. And see the difference between the southern red mite and a spider mite, if you look at this picture, there are no webs. If you have webs that go from one leaf to another, then you have spider mites. That's how you tell the difference. And so, usually people just say this is spider mites, and it's not. It's southern red, and they're just a really problem. And it's very interesting. You might have, if you have 10 camellias, they may only feed on one of them. There are certain varieties that they just love, and we just don't know exactly why that is, why they'll go to one and not touch another. So it's good if you have like an indicator plant that tells you got them, then you want to spray them all so that they won't spread. And then here we have scale, and scale, this is T-scale. That's pretty ubiquitous on camellias. And that is, they can be more difficult to control. You can use some of the systemic insecticides that are available today. You can use oil. You got to spray underneath the leaf because the oil smothers them. Now, when you use oil, though, that won't go away. You just kill it, but it won't go away. So you got to remember that it just won't disappear when you treat it. that'll stay there, but they're dead. And so one of the things you want to do is plants that grow right down to the ground usually aggravate scale more than if you have them up off the ground anywhere from a foot to 18 inches. And that's why you see a lot of plants trim up off the ground. Plus people, worry about snakes and things like that. But that's really, it really helps with the scale to reduce the incidence of the scale. Okay, and so here we have some various insecticides and the miticides. I'm sure you're familiar with malathion and imidacloprid. That's like your Bayer Advanced product, orthene, Telstar, and then the dimethylate, which was known as Saigon, which is much more difficult to get today. And then you have the oils. These are the petroleum oil, sun spray, ultrafine, even just citrus oil. Citrus oil is perfect for camellias. All right. And so now we're going to talk about propagation and fertilization. Okay, so we're talking about fertilizer first. And so we have different types. Of course, we have controlled release today, and we have traditional. And traditional, we have either inorganic and organic. And then there's water-soluble fertilizers, and there's foliar fertilizers. So these are all different types of things that you can use. And so, so this is either for plants in the ground or in containers. You can use a controlled release. And this is the preferred is the 15-9-11 with some micronutrients. And in our climate, we can use a 12-month fertilizer. In the Mid-South, you'd want to use an 8 to 9. So you won't have growth, growth in the fall that might get injured by cold weather. And then you can also use the typical Osmocote, which has been around for many, many years, which is a 14-14-14, but that only lasts for 3 months. So those are your, if you're a lazy gardener, don't like to, worry about fertilizing, 2 and 3 times a year, the controlled release is your best bet, but they are more expensive and they can be more difficult to source. So here's the brands of controlled release. You've got the Osmocote, which is available through most of the good garden centers. And Polyan is primarily for professional growers. Planticote and Nutricote are also some others that are available. And these are just what they look like. And Osmocote being up on the top right-hand side is Osmocote yellow. And the others, the other brands. Okay, so our traditional fertilizers are inorganic, which I just call garden fertilizer. You got your 10-10-10, 8-8. They release over a short time. Now, this is actually what I recommend that you use for big plants. If you've got big old plants that are well established, you can just use 10-10-10 and they just love it. I mean, they like to be fed at least that once a year. And if you do it twice, they'll even be better. And that improves your flower quality too, particularly if you do one that's kind of late in the year, like September, which you can fertilize that late without problems. You just want, don't overdo it because you do have the more potential to burn with these, with the typical garden fertilizer. Okay, now, so then we have our organic fertilizers, okay, and they come in all different ratios, 8-2-2, 4-2-2, 4-2-4, whatever. And these are, they're derived from organic substances. And the one that camellias love is cottonseed meal. And if you read any old literature about camellias, everybody used cottonseed meal, and they like it a lot. I don't know what it is in cottonseed meal, but I even use it in the containers and they just respond to it. Then you can use holly tone, which is available at garden centers. I also like worm castings. And then we can use mill organite and even alfalfa pellets. All of those contain nitrogen. But cottonseed meal is really the preferred thing for camellias in particular. However, I must caution you that when you, I mean, if you buy cottonseed meal at a garden center, and I'm sure that will be fine. But if you go to, let's say, a gin where cotton is actually processed, and I'm sure you have some of those there in South Carolina, like we have in Georgia, you must make sure that when you ask for it, that it is for growing plants or horticultural use, because most cottonseed meal in this part of the country is used for animal feed, and they add salt to it. And if you put that on your plants, you will kill them, period. So you've got to get the cottonseed. And so, like, I just ordered some from our gin, which is over in Quitman, Georgia, and they know all about it. And you just have to call and order it, and it'll be the pure cottonseed meal, nothing else added. So just to let you know, because this is something a lot of people don't realize about it. But these materials are released over a fairly long period of time, but you do need to put them on about 2 to 3 times a year for if you want to get maximum growth out of your plants. Low potential to burn, and most of the nutrient release is controlled by microbial breakdown in the soil. That's how the nutrients become available to the plant. Okay. And so the other type of fertilizer are your water-soluble fertilizers. I'm sure you're familiar with either like Peters or your Miracle Grow that you can buy. These are primarily used if you need a fast response. You got a deficiency showing up, you want it corrected quickly, you can use these, but I don't recommend these for any kind of long-term growth because they're easily leached. They just don't last very long. And then there's foliar fertilizers where you want to actually feed the foliage. And that's really good for micronutrients if you happen to have a deficiency of one of the micronutrients, iron in particular, and that works really well. But as far as a way to keep your plants healthy all the time, it's really not it doesn't really work that well. It's mainly to correct problems. Okay, now let's move on to propagation. I'm going to talk about air layers, cuttings, and grafting. And I know I'm probably going a little long here. But air layering is the easiest way to propagate camellias to get kind of a large plant, if you want. Because with these big plants that some people have, you can just air layer a whole limb off, okay? And you get something that'll bloom in about 2 years. But you do need to be aware that they are slow to develop a good root system because you have what we call a poor initial root to shoot ratio. And what that is you have a very small root system and a fairly large shoot or plant to support when you do an air layer. And so this is a typical air layer, okay, where it's wrapped with foil on a nice straight limb, and you get all these nice roots. But you see how you got a lot of roots, but you also got a lot of shoots. So that's where we say the root shoot. So I've got kind of just a how-to. And you do this in late spring when the bark is slipping. That's the typical time to do it. So you want to find a nice straight limb, 3 to 5 feet long. Find that place to apply the moss. You remove a section of the bark completely around the stem. So you girdle the stem, apply a rooting hormone to that area. You wrap it in the shredded sphagnum moss so that where the roots will develop, which are right above the girdled area. Okay, you want to use heavy duty foil. It works better so that they won't dry out. And you want to remove that branch before freezing. Now, when you do this, you put your sphagnum moss in a bucket of water and you let it soak for just a little while. And when you put it around that stem, you squeeze out as much water, excess water as you can. So it's just moist, and so, because you don't want it too wet or it really won't root too well. Okay, so this is an example of, okay, so this is the girdling showing there on the lower left screen. However, this was girdled using pliers. And this is another way that you can do it. You can actually do air layering in the winter time, like now, or really right after blooming, before the bark is slipping. I mean, it's really hard to remove that bark with a knife when it's not slipping. You just can't get it real. But you can take pliers and you can just sort of rip the bark off and then kind of make it neat using like a razor blade knife. And one of the a lot of people have been doing this type of air layering recently because you can do it when, first of all, there aren't any mosquitoes, okay? Because, you know, if you wait till May, there's mosquitoes and they'll be in the bushes. So it's just the way, and, you know, and it starts getting hot. So if you do it now, it's just so easy to do, and you don't have mosquitoes and it's not hot, and, you know, and it still works, and it still works. And then you just take that off in the early, usually it's ready by September or October in that case. And of course, the other way in which we root, and this is the way I grow most of my plants, is to do it from cuttings. And you want to do the mature terminal growth. And usually the growth has what we call, the color of the bark is a chocolate colored. When it's that chocolate colored, it's ready. You don't want any green on it because they usually don't root they'll rot. You want 3 to 4 stems, and you remove the lower leaves and you wound them on both sides. And you dip them in some IBA or like root tone, and you put them under mist, or you put them in a plastic tent. They take 2 to 3 months to root, and then you want to pot them before the new growth starts. And so here are some typical cuttings. So you got the ones that are the long ones up there on the top right, before they're pruned and trimmed. And so on the bottom right, they're ready to be stuck. But you also need to wound them. And so they wound them on both sides of the stem. And that encourages root development completely around the stem instead of just on one side or at the bottom. So you put it in a rooting product, and I use trays, but you can use anything you want as far as rooting. But you need a mix that's very airy. So usually around 40 to 50% perlite is great. A mist house, of course, is what I use. But you can put them under a tent, under a jar, and that whatever, just to keep the humidity at 100% all the time during the rooting process. And so this is one of the reasons you want to wound your stems, because if the one on the left, if you don't wound it, you're going to get 1 or 2 roots that comes out of the bottom of the stem. And when that plant gets larger, it will fall over because it doesn't have a good stability, because it's not got roots all the way around the stem like the one showing on the right. So wounding is really important to stimulate root growth more uniformly around the stem. And if you do everything right, you can get a 6-month-old cutting to grow. Here we have one almost 30 inches tall. So they do really good, because you got a great root system. It's all about roots. And so now is the time when you start to graft camellias. Actually, we will be starting next week. I'll be starting to graft. And the cleft graft is the most common type for camellias that people do. It's easy to do. It's done, like I said, January through March. You can do it in containers or in the ground. And you need to use rootstock that's anywhere from 2 to 3 years old, or you can use old mature plants in your yard. And I'll talk about that. So here's a typical cleft graft that that's grown. Actually, this was probably 2 years old, I would think, and it's growing over the stem. So when you do a cleft graft, you cut it down through the middle about 2 inches. Then you take your pliers and you open it, or I mean a screwdriver, and you open it up. And if you notice that little green ring around that stem, that is the only part of that stem that's alive. Everything else is just wood, dead wood. So you have to match up your little piece of what we call a scion to that layer of cambium. So you put it in right along the edge. Okay, and here's your scion that you would prepare. And then you put that right along the edge. And I don't have a really, really great slide of that, unfortunately. But so, and this is a way in which we do older plants. You can graft an older plant and change it. And this is something I recommend to people all the time who have nice big old camellias in their yard and they're just not very pretty, or they want something different. You can just change them. It's easy to change them. And then you put a little, put a little tent over them, because again, you got to keep that 100% humidity. And then you put a little paper bag over that so that it won't overheat. And then this is the way you would do it in the ground. And we use styrofoam cups. And then this is what you get at the end of all that grafting work. So here we have one growing from a pot, or it could be in the ground, growing out very healthy, because with that nice big root system, in this case, the root to shoot ratio is good for shoots, because you got a gigantic root system and a very little bit of shoot, and they just grow like crazy. So the one on the right is actually a plant that I had growing in my collection that I think I had 2 or 3 of the same thing. I said, well, I don't need 2 or 3, and I wanted something new. So I changed it. That's a 1-year-old graft. It was done last year. And I just do multiple stems. They're all the same variety. So basically, when you do that, you have a new plant. In 2 to 3 years, you would never know you grafted that. It'll be completely regrown. They grow so fast because of the size of the root system. So now we'll look at some pretty pictures. And so some of these are some of the varieties I know that the Society has available for sale that I've grown. This is Big Daddy. This is Kyle. And this is Lily and Gordy. And this is probably the most amazing new camellia we have today. This blooms in October without gibberellic acid, and it will be 6 inches across. And it is a magnificent plant. Grows good, has no disease problems, and it's still blooming now. Started in October, and it's still blooming right now. So it's an incredible plant. And this is one from Charleston. This is Sarah Elizabeth. This is Cutie Buttons, a little white flower. This is Volcano. Volcano will bloom all up and down, so it looks like it's erupting. That originated in New Zealand. Let me see. This is this is Bessie Battle. All of these. This is Wendy. This is Burgundy Rose. This is Camille. I believe what's available this year is a Camille variegated, which would have white in it. And this is actually Kyle. Sorry, I got those mixed up. And this is Katie Northcutt. And this is Amy Connor, which originated there on Edisto Island. And this is Early Autumn. And this is Camellia handeli, which is a completely different camellia. This is another one. This is a species that's from southern China, loves our climate, loves the hot, humid weather, and then it will bloom prolifically, right? It's just starting right now here, and it'll bloom up and down the stems, and it's just an incredible plant. And when you have a nice large plant like this, because the flowers are small, but it's quite fragrant. But it does get big. It can get over 8 feet tall. So just be aware of that. It will get really big. And it's really the most beautiful when it's big because it does this weeping thing. Okay, this is Terry Gilly, variegated. And this is, let's see, I think that's Frank Hauser. Mary Edna Curley, and this originated in Orangeburg. And this is Georgia Fire. That's one of my favorites, Georgia Fire. That's your classic rose form camellia. And then, so what's new? I just thought I would show you the things kind of that I do. So so we have camellias that are named for the first ladies of Georgia. The top 3 are kind of what I call the originals. The Betty Foy Sanders was actually, which is the white with the speckles. That was registered back in the 1960s, named for Betty Foy Sanders, who was the first lady to live in the new mansion that's in Atlanta, in Buckhead area. And so then the one next to that, the pink one is Rosalind Carter, and that was named in the 90s. And then the one on the right is Sandra Deal. So in a project with Mrs. Deal, she wanted to have a camellia for every first lady who's lived in the governor's mansion that's there in Atlanta. And luckily it was built in the 60s, so we didn't have to go back to the 1700s. So we got one for everyone who's lived in the house since it was built. And so that's what the others are. And so the last one in the bottom corner is our current first lady, that is Marty Kemp. So that's just something that I worked with the governor's wife on, is naming all these camellias. And we have this First Lady collection that's being planted throughout the state in public areas. So I'm real proud of this. And so that concludes my program. And so if you're ever in Georgia, visit Loch Laurel Nursery or go to my website, lochlaurelnursery.com. Thank you very much.
All right.
I will answer some.
How are you, Mark? Thank you. That was fantastic. So much information, and we do have time for a few questions.
That's fine. Questions are good.
For you, real quick, if that's okay. Let me scroll back a little bit. The first question I see here is, can you cut off one of the double stems before the plant becomes too large?
Cut off the double stems. What? You mean if you just want a single stalk growing up? Yeah, sure, you can.
And can you cut off a branch and force bloom it?
No, they really only if it's, let's say, about 50% open will it continue to open, but they don't force like other plants.
You mentioned, let's see, about the paint. What type of paint do you use to paint the cut ends?
Well, you can get pruning paint that's available in like garden centers. It's like it's kind of an asphalt paint. I actually use a copper-based paint, which gives some fungicidal activity, but that's not readily available.
Can you go on a little bit more about the paint itself? And a couple of people said they were concerned about not painting it, then maybe they shouldn't. Is there a better reason?
No, I do not. I recommend anything more than 1 inch in diameter, you should paint it. Now, little things, no, not necessary.
Right.
But no, because I've seen lots of old camellias that have been improperly pruned, and a lot of times they have hollow stems because they didn't prune that or paint that properly.
Let
Remember, they get that dieback disease, and you created a wound, which is the port of entry, how that fungus gets in. And you need to seal it so that it won't get in. And that's why you want to do it. And I know that in trees and things that people, they don't recommend the painting, but that's native trees and things, that's fine. You don't
right.
need to paint those. I agree with that, but not camellias.
Should you clean up spent leaves as they fall or wait?
Oh, well, you probably should just wait till they're all falling off, and then if you want to clean them up. But usually, unless you've got a big scale problem,
Yeah.
and that's caused the leaves to fall off, then you do want to clean those up as soon as you can.
Right. But there's no other rhyme or reason.
But if it's just the natural senescing leaf, it's really not necessary. You know, if they're clean leaves that are falling off, yeah, that's not really necessary.
I think this question here is a follow-up to something you already talked about. If you layer cardboard and pine straw and remove each year, does this prevent blight?
Yeah, it probably would, but the problem is your neighbor.
Right.
Problem is your neighbor. If he doesn't do that too, then, you know, but if you're isolated, all of those things actually work pretty well.
Right. That would make sense.
Yeah.
Can you apply the oil for mites now? And when is the best time to apply the oil?
Yeah, I mean, we had mites right before the freeze. They're kind of not active now, but yeah, you can put the oil on. In fact, you can use the heavier weight dormant oil now, as long as the temperature, I believe it needs to be above 55. I think it's on the label what the threshold temperature is.
Right.
But yeah, you only use the dormant oil in the winter when it's cool and the plant's not growing, and then you go to the horticultural sun oils in the summer. And you don't want to apply any oil above 90 degrees.
This viewer makes their own compost, and they say it's wonderful, and ask, is it a good idea to spread that compost around their camellia plant, and if so, when?
As long as you don't put it up too deep, it's fine.
Yeah.
You just don't want to bury the roots, and because the roots on camellias are fairly shallow. That's another reason you plant them high. They like to be up high.
Is there a specific variety that is better for container planting? Anything you recommend? Is there a difference?
Yeah, container planting can be tricky. And it depends. I mean, is the plant going to be in the sun or is it going to be in the shade? I mean, there's a lot of things that affect that. And how big a container. You don't want to overpot a camellia. So if you don't want to put them like in a big urn unless it's a big plant.
Right.
They don't like all that extra soil.
A little bit more compact.
There are some varieties that definitely do better in a container than others. Some don't like for example, Pink Perfection, which is a very popular variety, does not like to be in a pot. And the reason is it doesn't like the elevated root temperature associated with being in a container. And that's what it's all about. It's the fact that the roots are at a higher temperature when they're in a container than when they're in the ground.
This is an interesting question. This viewer has a very large 20-year-old, very healthy looking plant that produces lots and lots of buds but never flowers. What can we do to help them?
Oh, you can't really do, that's one of those varieties that came from Europe, probably. Like I was saying, that they don't open. There's a lot of those, and there's probably more of those in Charleston than anywhere. And that's one of the problems with the
Yeah.
ones, because in Europe, they have, it's much colder for a longer period of time. So it's kind of like a chill hour effect, like, on fruit trees. And yeah, this is something with all the real old varieties that came, a lot of those were brought from Europe. And they were in New Jersey or in different places up there, and then brought down. And some of them just don't do. That's the kind of plant you cut it down and you graft on it and change it to something that you like.
All right, exactly. One question here: the Lillian on sale that we have for sale, is that the same one that you were talking about that blooms for a long time?
Yes.
Okay. And of course, the Kyle.
And by the way, I'm the only source of that. By the way.
Oh, well, that's that. Everyone
Period.
for that when you're perusing our plant site, and of course, make sure you buy the Kyle camellia. I'm sure it's the best.
It's a beauty.
It's beautiful.
Kyle came from Mississippi.
Oh, I went to school in Mississippi, so that's perfect. An old Miss boy. All right, Mark. That covers most of our questions, and everybody also, you're getting a lot of accolades as well for a great presentation. Here's a question that popped up. One last question: can you recommend camellia for the north, like a zone 7B or A?
You mean in this group that we have for sale?
Not necessarily. I think that this person.
Well, there's a lot of the cold hardy varieties. They've got one that's called the April series, like April Remembered and April this and April that. There's a bunch of those. Those are cold hardy. Of course, Sasanquas are cold hardy in zone 7.
Oh, all right.
Problem.
Well, hopefully that's a broad variety of answer too. So that might be
Yeah. So yeah, Sasanquas are more, because see, they bloom in the fall before it gets cold.
And also, did you reference your beautiful presentation behind you? You did, didn't you?
Oh, well, I don't.
Shoulder there.
I don't know. I didn't really. I didn't really say anything about it.
It's a nice backdrop. We appreciate the effort. It looks lovely. So, Mark, thank you. Everyone, we've got several questions that will the slides be available? This whole presentation will be saved, and I will put it up on our YouTube channel, and the only people that get access to it are those of you who attended today or people who purchased and did not make it. So you all will get a copy of this as well. I saw one person ask when the Camellia Walk at Middleton will be. That will be Saturday, February 27th, and you will start hearing about that early next week. Again, don't forget our Camellia sale continues. Mark, you are a wealth of knowledge. We are really, really honored and thrilled to have you here. So thank you for taking the time tonight to be with us and share your expertise. It is most appreciated.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention, everyone.
Absolutely.
I'm really honored that you had such a good crowd.
We did. And
yes. So if everybody, I don't know whether they can still hear me, but the flowers that I have here back, these all just came out of my yard today.
Wow.
Went out there and picked them.
Just casually.
I have 500 varieties in the yard, so there's a bunch.
Well, I remind everybody to go back to our website and peruse the new stuff and the stuff that we already have up for sale. We're thrilled to be able to provide this. And Mark, you are fantastic. So thank you. Everyone have a good evening. Mark, it's been a pleasure.